Let's call this meeting of your Newark City Council to order. Autumn, please call the roll.
Mr. Rath?
Here.
Mr. Blake? Mr. Bub?
Here.
Mr. Cross?
Here.
Mr. Fennell?
Here.
Mr. Frazier?
Here.
Ms. Hall?
Here.
Mr. Labutus?
Here.
Mr. Lang?
Here.
And Mr. Marmee?
Present. We have 9 here this evening. Please rise for the invocation by Mr. Labutus. We're going to have the Boy Scouts come up and do the Pledge of Allegiance.
Correct. Heavenly Father, we come in prayer right now. We thank you for this day you've given us, another day to serve you. I just ask you to be with us this evening as we discuss the matters of the city, and that we would keep your vision for our city in mind. Bless our interactions this evening. We praise your name. In Jesus' name, amen.
Mr. Carter's going to either bring him up or George Carter's the scout leader. They're going to lead us in the pledge. Get that. Good looking group. Flags up this way, guys. There we go. There you go. Scout sign.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Scouts. Nice job. Next on the agenda, we have caucus. That's the time for council to discuss anything pertaining to the agenda tonight.
Mr. President,
Mr. Marmee.
make a motion to excuse Mr. Blake.
Motion to excuse Mr. Blake by Mr. Marmee.
Second.
Second by Mr. Frazier. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Same sign. Thank you. We also have a Rule 11 this evening. Rule 11 is when the majority, Mr. Marmee, and minority, Mr. Cost leader, agree that we can hear a piece of legislation that hasn't gone through committee. So is that okay with you, Mr. Marmee and Mr. Cost? Okay. Autumn's going to read this, and then we're going to refer it to the Planning Commission. Autumn, would you read 19-31?
Ordinance 19-31 by Mr. Rath, Mr. Marmee, Mr. Cost, an ordinance changing the zoning classification of certain real property generally described as 595 Thornwood Drive, City of Newark, Licking County, Ohio, from that of GB General Business District, GI General Industrial District, GO General Office District, MFC Multifamily Condo District, and MFR Multifamily Residence District as shown on the attached Exhibit A to LI Limited Industrial District Zoning Code of the City of Newark, Ohio in its entirety and declaring an emergency.
Again, this will be referred to the Planning Commission, and it will come back to council for a vote. So thank you, gentlemen. Next, we have the minutes of our October 7th, 2019 meeting. Is there a motion to approve those? Motion by Mr. Labutus.
Second.
Second by Mr. Frazier. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. That passes. Thank you. Next, we have reports of standing committees, one from Finance and one from Economic Development. Without objection, those will be received and filed. We also have 2 reports from city officials this evening, both from Barb Jobs, our city tax administrator. The income tax revenue reports for the periods ending September 30th and October 15th, 2019. Those will be filed. Under communications, we have one this evening from the Ohio EPA. Notice of National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit was issued for the old Newark City landfill on Watson Road. Next on the agenda this evening, we have a public hearing. We're going to open the public hearing now. Autumn, would you please read the public hearing notice?
Notice of hearing. Notice is hereby given that the Newark City Council shall at a later date to be determined and announced hereafter take action upon ordinance number 19-22. Said ordinance accepts a proposed amendment to the zoning map attached to ordinance 08-33A, which would allow the changing of the zoning classification of certain real property generally described as 1445 West Main Street, City of Newark, Ohio, Licking County, from that of MFR Multifamily District to NB Medium Intensity Business District. The text of such ordinances, together with the copy of the ordinance 08-33A and the zoning map attached thereto, and the maps, plans, and reports submitted by the Newark Planning Commission relative to said zoning are on file for public examination in the office of the clerk of Newark City Council at 40 West Main Street, Newark, Ohio.
Thank you, Autumn. Again, this public hearing is open. Is there anyone here to speak for or against? Anyone here would like to speak for or against? One more time, anyone to speak on this public hearing on West Main? Okay, we're going to go ahead and close the public hearing. Autumn, would you please read 19-22 then for the second time, and then we'll vote.
Ordinance 19-22 by Mr. Rath, Mr. Cost, Mr. Marmee, and Mr. Frazier, an ordinance changing the zoning classification of certain real property generally described as 1435, 1445 West Main Street, City of Newark, Licking County, Ohio, from that of MFR, Multifamily Residence District, to MB, Medium Intensity Business District, zoning code of the City of Newark, Ohio.
Thank you, Autumn. You've heard the second reading of 19-22. What is your wish?
Mr. President.
Mr. Rath.
I would like to make a motion to adopt 19-22.
Motion by Mr. Rath to adopt 19-22.
Second.
Second by Mr. Frazier. Do we have any discussion on 19-22? Autumn, please call the roll vote.
Mr. Rath,
Yes.
Mr. Blake, Mr. Bub,
Yes.
Mr. Cost,
Yes.
Mr. Fennell,
Yes.
Mr. Frazier,
Yes.
Ms. Hall,
yes,
Mr. Labutus,
Yes.
Mr. Lang,
Yes.
and Mr. Marmee.
Yes.
19-22 passes 9-0. Next on the agenda, we have comments from citizens. That's a time for you folks to have an opportunity to be heard. This is not a debate with council or a question and answer period. This is just a time for you to speak your piece if you like. Anyone in the audience would like to speak this first section? Again, there's one other section after the legislation, so. Okay, we'll move on to ordinances on the second reading, 19-25.
Ordinance 19-25 by Mr. Marmee, Mr. Cost, Mr. Labutus, Mr. Frazier, and Mr. Lang. An ordinance authorizing and directing the Newark City Safety Director to certify to the Licking County Auditor the sum of $260,732.01 incurred by the Newark City Property Maintenance Division with respect to property maintenance violations to be placed as a lien upon certain parcels of real property situated in the City of Newark, Ohio.
You've heard the second reading of 19-25. What is your wish?
Mr. President.
Mr. Fennell? Or Mr.
Oh.
Who was that? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, Mr. President.
Mr. Rath.
I'd like to make a motion to adopt 19-25.
Motion by Mr. Rath, second by Mr. Cost. Is there any discussion on 19-25? Seeing none, Autumn, please call the roll to vote.
Mr. Rath,
Yes.
Mr. Blake, Mr. Bub,
Yes.
Mr. Cost,
Yes.
Mr. Fennell,
Yes.
Mr. Frazier,
Yes.
Ms. Hall,
yes,
Mr. Labutus,
Yes.
Mr. Lang,
Yes.
and Mr. Marmee.
Yes.
You can tell my hearing is going, so I'm sorry about that one. Next, we have on the second reading, 19-26.
Ordinance 19-26 by Mr. Rath, Mr. Cost, Mr. Labutus, Mr. Frazier, Mr. Marmee, and Mr. Lang. An ordinance vacating a part of a 16 1/2 foot wide alley and part of lots 136 and 149 of the original plat of the City of Newark, as recorded in Plat Book 2, page 4 of the Licking County Plat Records. Said alley is located south of Scheidler Street between South First Street and South Second Street.
You've heard the second reading of 19-26. What is your wish?
I'd like to make a motion to adopt ordinance 19-26.
Motion to adopt by Mr. Fennell,
Second.
second by Mr. Frazier. Is there any discussion on 19-26? Seeing none, Autumn, please call the roll to vote.
Mr. Rath,
Yes.
Mr. Blake, Mr. Bub,
Yes.
Mr. Cost,
Yes.
Mr. Fennell,
Yes.
Mr. Frazier,
Yes.
Ms. Hall,
yes,
Mr. Labutus,
Yes.
Mr. Lang,
Yes.
and Mr. Marmee.
Yes.
19-26 passes 9-0. Next, on the second reading, we have 19-27.
Ordinance 19-27 by Mr. Rath, Mr. Cost, Mr. Labutus, Mr. Marmee, Mr. Lang, an ordinance vacating a 12-foot wide alley as shown on the plat of Wintermute Edition as recorded in Plat Book 3, page 121 of the Licking County Plat Records. Said alley is located south of Steel Avenue between South 29th Street and South 30th Street.
You've heard the second reading of 19-27. What is your wish?
I'd like to make a motion to adopt ordinance 19-27.
Motion by Mr. Fennell,
Second.
second by Mr. Frazier. Do we have any discussion on 19-27? Seeing none, Autumn, please call the roll to vote.
Mr. Rath,
Yes.
Mr. Blake, Mr. Bub,
Yes.
Mr. Cost,
Yes.
Mr. Fennell,
Yes.
Mr. Frazier,
Yes.
Ms. Hall,
yes,
Mr. Labutus,
Yes.
Mr. Lang,
Yes.
and Mr. Marmee.
Yes.
19-27 passes 9-0. And one more on the second reading, 19-28.
Ordinance 19-28 by Mr. Rath, Mr. Cost, Mr. Labutus, Mr. Marmee, Mr. Lang, an ordinance vacating a 16 and 1/2 foot wide alley as shown on the plat of the town of Lockport as recorded in Plat Book 2, page 100 of the Licking County Plat Records. Said alley is located between 33 and 45 Union Street.
You've heard the second reading of 19-28. What is your wish?
I'd like to make a motion to adopt ordinance 19-28.
Motion by Mr. Fennell.
Second.
Second by Mr. Frazier. Do we have any discussion on 19-28? Seeing none, I'll please call the roll vote.
Mr. Rapp,
Yes.
Mr. Blake, Mr. Bub,
Yes.
Mr. Cost,
Yes.
Mr. Fennell,
Yes.
Mr. Frazier,
Yes.
Ms. Hall,
yes,
Mr. Labutus,
Yes.
Mr. Lang,
Yes.
and Mr. Marmee.
Yes.
And 19-28 passes 9-0. Now we move on to ordinances on the first reading, 19-32.
Ordinance 19-32 by Mr. Rapp, Mr. Cost, Mr. Marmee, an ordinance accepting the dedication to use of the public, dedication to public use of the streets in Timpson Woods subdivision Phase 4.
Easy for you to say. 19-32 will be held for 2 weeks for a second reading until on November 4th, our next meeting. Next on the first reading, we have 19-33.
Ordinance 19-33 by Mr. Rapp, Mr. Cost, Mr. Marmee, an ordinance accepting the plat of lot 13100 of the Meadow at River Bend subdivision as recorded in instrument 200400211004930 of the Licking County Plat Records.
And 19-33 will be held for 2 weeks to our second reading, to our November 4th meeting. Now we have resolutions on the first reading, 19-48.
Resolution 19-48 by Mr. Marmee, Mr. Bub, Mr. Cost, Mr. Rapp, Mr. Frazier, a resolution appropriating monies for the current expenses of the municipal corporation.
19-48 will be held for 2 weeks to our next meeting, November 4th. And next we have 19-70.
Resolution 19-70 by Mr. Marmee, Mr. Bub, Mr. Cost, Mr. Rapp, and Mr. Frazier, a resolution appropriating monies for the current expenses of the municipal corporation.
19-70.
Mr. President.
Mr. Marmee.
I make a motion to waive the 2-day reading rule on resolution 19-70.
Motion to waive the 2-day reading rule by Mr. Marmee. Second by Mr. Cost. Mr. Marmee.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have some individuals who we have to pay their payouts that are retiring, and we also have to return some money that we did not use in grants, so we need to expedite those to get those funds to those individuals.
Thank you, Mr. Marmee. I'll please call the roll to waive the 2-day reading rule.
Mr. Rapp,
Yes.
Mr. Blake, Mr. Bub,
Yes.
Mr. Cost,
Yes.
Mr. Fennell,
Yes.
Mr. Frazier,
Yes.
Ms. Hall,
yes,
Mr. Labutus,
Yes.
Mr. Lang,
Yes.
and Mr. Marmee.
Yes.
I'm sorry, the 2-day reading rule has been waived. Mr. Marmee.
Thank you, Mr. President. I make a motion to adopt resolution 19-70.
Motion to adopt by Mr. Marmee, second by Mr. Cost. Is there any other discussion on 19-70? Seeing none, I'll please call the roll vote.
Mr. Rapp,
Yes.
Mr. Blake, Mr. Bub,
Yes.
Mr. Cost,
Yes.
Mr. Fennell,
Yes.
Mr. Frazier,
Yes.
Ms. Hall,
yes,
Mr. Labutus,
Yes.
Mr. Lang,
Yes.
and Mr. Marmee.
Yes.
And 19-70 passes 9-0. Next on the first reading, we have 19-71.
Resolution 19-71 by Mr. Marmee, Mr. Bub, Mr. Cost, Mr. Rapp, Mr. Frazier, a resolution appropriating monies for the current expenses of the municipal corporation.
19-71 will be held for 2 weeks until November 4th. And next we have 19-72.
Resolution 19-72 by Mr. Rapp, Mr. Bub, Mr. Cost, Mr. Marmee, and Mr. Frazier, a resolution petitioning the Board of Licking County Commissioners to accept the amendment of the previously established enterprise zone and to designate the entire city of Newark as an enterprise zone in accordance with the section 5709.61 through 5709.66 of the Ohio Revised Code and declaring an emergency.
19-72 is on its first reading, but it is an emergency. What is your wish?
Mr. President,
Mr. Frazier.
I make a motion to adopt 1972.
Motion to adopt by Mr. Frazier,
Second.
second by Mr. Lang. Is there any discussion on 19-72? Mr. Frazier.
President, this item was in order to clean up some of the southern portions. There is a resolution that's required to make it an enterprise zone, and it's kind of a bookkeeping piece in order to move forward with the Thornwood Crossing project.
Mr. Frazier, anyone else? Autumn, please call the roll vote.
Mr. Rapp,
Yes.
Mr. Bub, or excuse me, Mr. Blake, Mr. Bub,
Yes.
Mr. Cost,
Yes.
Mr. Fennell,
Yes.
Mr. Frazier,
Yes.
Ms. Hall,
yes,
Mr. Labutus,
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
And Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
19-72 passes 9-0. Next on the first reading, we have 19-73.
Resolution 19-73 by Mr. Rath, Mr. Cost, Mr. Marmee, Mr. Frazier, a resolution authorizing and directing the mayor of the city of Newark, Ohio to execute the joint economic development zone contract amendment number 1 by and between the city of Newark, Ohio and Etna Township, Ohio.
19-73 will be held for 2 weeks. And finally, we have 19-74.
Resolution 19-74 by Mr. Marmee, Mr. Cost, Mr. Rath, and Mr. Frazier, a resolution authorizing and directing the mayor of the city of Newark to prepare and submit to the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development a 5-year consolidated plan and a 1-year use of funds action plan, along with a required application for the fiscal year 2020 federal community development block grant funds as required by 24 CFR Part 91.220 for various programs related to housing and community development.
And 19-74 will be held for 2 weeks for our next meeting. You'll get to read it again. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate your attendance tonight and your patience. Next, we move on to our second opportunity for comments from citizens. Again, the same rules apply. Is there anyone who would like to speak? Okay. Anyone from administration this evening would like to speak? Law Director Sassen.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Director Sassen. Mr. Rath.
Thank you. I just want to say thanks to the Boy Scouts for coming and joining us. I hope we didn't bore you too much. I want to say thank you for Darren DeGrasse, who came and presented to the Service Committee tonight about the Census Bureau and their task at hand. It is very important that everybody gets counted, and it's an important message that he gets that out there. So I hope everybody else helps with that message as well. And with that, I will call a Service Committee meeting for our next meeting, whatever that is.
November 4th.
November 4th, thank you. And with that, I'll pass.
Thank you, Mr. Rath. Mr. Butler.
Just want to thank the scouts as well for coming out this evening. Thank you for your patience, and have a good evening. With that, I'll pass.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd. Mr. Cost? I will pass. Thank you, Mr. Cost. Our newest 20 under 40. Bill and I just missed the cut, but Mr.
Maybe next year?
Maybe, well, hey, it wasn't that fun. Mr. Fennell.
Yes, I'd also like to thank Aaron Degris for coming out. I think that the census is a really critical thing for our community, so I appreciate all the efforts that are coming with that. Thank you to the Boy Scouts for coming out and leading us in our pledge. I would also ask that everybody keep Jeremy and his family in their thoughts and prayers for the loss of his grandmother. So that's why he's not here this evening. I just wanted to pass that along. So with that, I will.
Thank you, Mr. Fennell. Mr. Frazier?
Mr. President.
Mr. Frazier.
So I want to thank the administration that worked with North Street Park, and so the equipment and the shelter house is there, and there's some last finishing touches that they should finish within the next 2 weeks. I encourage anybody to go out with families. Previously, the equipment was destroyed by a tree, and so there was no equipment there, and it's a really neat thing to see happen in a really relatively short amount of time to have all that go in. I was really interested in the U.S. Census presentation as well. One of those key statistics that they had was a 33% poverty rate based in 2010 for the city of Newark. The current rate that they have based on their American Community Survey is 20.5%. So I'm really excited to see the metrics in which the city is improving, especially when it comes to home ownership and poverty. And hopefully we see a continued improvement in the city of Newark from 2010 to 2020. Also, I want to thank the federal government for giving the CDBG funds and providing that to the city of Newark, and those are being distributed. And there are some grant applications available with the city as well. There's also U.S. Census jobs, so if you know anybody that's looking for a job over the next year, there's part-time, full-time, and various different kinds of employment with them. Go to the U.S. Census website, and also on October 31st is Trick or Treat, so please buy your candy and be prepared. And with that, I'll yield.
Thank you, Mr. Frazier. Ms. Hall?
Thank you. I just want to thank the Boy Scouts for being here as well. It's really nice, and please visit anytime, okay? And with that, I'll pass.
Thank you, Ms. Hall. Mr. Levitas?
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank the Scouts for doing a fantastic job on the pledge. Also want to thank our Streets Department for putting up some requested neighborhood watch signs in the ward, and we put those up last week. And also in the Parks Department, there was some overgrowth in one of the parks in the area, and they trimmed that up as well, made that look nice. So special thanks to them as well. With that, I will yield.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Mr. Lang.
Thank you, Mr. President. Boy Scouts, thank you guys for coming tonight. Apologize, my voice is going, but I do want to remind folks that early voting is going on right now. We've got some important city races coming up, and I'd encourage everybody to get out and vote. The Board of Elections is open every day from Monday to Friday, 8 to 5. So get down there and vote if you don't want to stand in a longer line on election day. With that, I'll yield.
Thank you, Mr. Lang. And Mr. Martin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I too want to thank the Scouts for coming out, and I hope you could follow along with everything that was done up here. I'm sure it was not as interesting as you might think, but a lot of what we do actually happens in committees. So we do appreciate you coming, though, and leading us in the pledge. And hopefully this will earn you something towards maybe your next badge or something. So I greatly appreciate you being here. We need to call a Finance Committee meeting. And the last thing is go Bucks, beat the Badgers. And with that, I pass.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. You know, my thanks to the Scouts for coming. You were very well mannered. You can come back anytime. You did a great job. Our next meeting will be, our next committee meeting will be 2 weeks from tonight at 5:45, November 4th here in this room. Our next full council meeting will be 7 p.m. that same night. That'll be the day before voting. Again, early voting is going on, so exercise your right to vote. Is there a motion to adjourn? Motion by Mr. Kloss, second by Mr. Blues. All in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye. Same sign. We're adjourned. Thanks for coming. We appreciate it.